Hey, this is Dr. Ben Weitz, host of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I talk to the leading health and nutrition experts and researchers in the field to bring you the latest in cutting-edge health information. Subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast for weekly updates. And to learn more, check out my website, drweitz.com. Thanks for joining me, and let's jump into the podcast. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Today, I'm excited to be talking about type 1 diabetes, which is not a topic we've spoken about very much on the Rational Wellness Podcast. We've had a number of conversations about type 2, but type 1 is a very important topic, and type 1 diabetics need a lot of help from a nutritional perspective that they often don't get. So what is type 1 diabetes? Most of us in the functional medicine world see a lot more patients with type 2, and that's because only about 5% of diabetics are type 1. But type 1 diabetes used to be known as juvenile diabetes, but it's probably better described as insulin-dependent diabetes. And in this condition, the pancreas produces little or no insulin. Insulin's a hormone that signals the muscles to pull sugar from the bloodstream to enter the cells to use for energy. It's generally understood that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune origin, and while it usually develops during childhood or adolescence, it can develop in adults. The cause of type 1 diabetes is controversial, and we're not going to go into all the possibilities, but there's discussions about gluten and dairy and a bunch of other issues that may contribute to the causation of type 1 diabetes. To lead the discussion this morning is Lauren Bongiorno, and she is a health coach, a diabetes influencer, and the founder and CEO of Risley Health. Lauren has dealt with type 1 diabetes since she was 7 years old. And she is challenging the current healthcare system and the world of diabetes management through her company's innovative health coaching programs and online educational classes. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Great. So maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about your journey and when you just first discovered that you had type 1 diabetes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting now, in our practice and in our health coaching company at Risley, we see people getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old. But like you said, earlier, it is very more well known that children get diagnosed. And so I was one of those children. And
by the way, why do you think more people are being diagnosed later with type 1?
Yeah. So you know what? I think that in the past, a lot of doctors have misdiagnosed adults as type 2. And so it just took a longer amount of time to get them the correct diagnosis. But COVID also, we saw a huge spike within the past 2 years of diagnosis after COVID and the stressors of either getting COVID and then having it afterwards, or just the life stressors with things changing in your routine and people dying in your life that maybe have potentially triggered.
Interesting. So there's been some discussion about viral triggers. So you're saying SARS-CoV-2 virus and or possibly the vaccine may have triggered an autoimmune process that's leading to type 1 diabetes.
Yeah. And there's more research coming out now about it. And I think it'll be something that over time will have to be looked at, but there is definitely some kind of relation between it.
Interesting. When it gets diagnosed later in life, it can be confusing because there's a type 1.5 diabetes, this latent onset, right? Diabetes that's different than type 1.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. There's many different types of diabetes. There's more than type 1 and type 2. I personally live with type 1, which is an autoimmune disease. My body doesn't produce insulin, which is basically the thing that helps take the sugar out of the bloodstream. And I was diagnosed at 7 years old. And so your whole entire life from that point is changed in the way that you're living. And you hear from a very young age, if you don't take care of yourself, hear all the terrible things that could happen to you. And as a child, you're like, oh, like that's so far away, right? right? But it sneaks up on you. So I'm going on 22 years of living with it. And I've been through many stages, of living with my diabetes, and it's way more complicated than just eat less carbs and exercise.
It must be pretty traumatic for a 7-year-old kid to suddenly have to start pricking your finger to measure your glucose levels and injecting insulin.
Yeah, I'd actually argue that it's more challenging for the parents than it is for the child a lot of the time. I know that my parents, and we also work with a lot of parents in our family coaching program at Risley, it is they went through the newborn stage, right, already with their child or multiple children. And this is kind of that like second wave of having a newborn, because you're waking up multiple times in the night to check your child's blood sugar. You're constantly focusing on all these hyper decisions that need to be made that you shouldn't have to think about as a parent, but you ultimately do when your child's diagnosed.
So, what are some of the most important variables that we need to manipulate to help manage patients with type 1 diabetes?
Yeah. So like I alluded to earlier, much of what we understand type 1 management to be is around nutrition and exercise. And just within those two categories, there is about 20 different factors that influence your blood sugars, right? There's the type of exercise you're doing, the time of exercise you're doing, how long you're exercising for, what your insulin sensitivity levels are, your resistance levels, where your starting number is at, what kind of food you have before it. And then within nutrition, it's combination of macros, timing of insulin, right? Like all of these different factors. And so that's just one part of already what we know, but under the surface, there's all these other levels. You can think of it as an iceberg, right? On the top of the water, you can see the most obvious things that you have to be looking at to manage your type 1 diabetes. But beneath the surface, you have things like relationship to food and your mindset to diabetes, how your acceptance level of it, right? Your hormones, your background cortisol levels, or for females, your whole entire 26 to 34 day cycle that's having, give or take, depending on your particular hormones, but that impacts your blood sugars, right? So there's so many of these other factors where type 1 diabetes is not like type 2, where you can take metformin, you can take a pill and it helps the majority of the symptoms. We're very much juggling all these factors at any given time.
Interesting. So, how do you recommend monitoring the glucose? I'm assuming you probably recommend one of the continuous glucose monitors available today.
Yeah, so the two main leading glucose monitors are the Freestyle Libre and the Dexcom G6. I believe the G7 just came out. This is for people with type 1 diabetes, the most popular. I wear the Dexcom. And the thing is that it's not that technology is not accessible to everybody. So you always have the option to be finger pricking to see what your blood sugar is. And I wish, and it should be, that these technologies and insulin pumps as well are available to everybody, but it's just not the case. But it does make your life so much easier, because you can just look down at your phone, in my case on the Dexcom, see what the blood sugar is, and make a decision based off of that. Now, on the flip side of it, you have people who are highly perfectionist, who you're never going to get your numbers perfect. And if you attach too much to it, it's going to drive you crazy, because if you're constantly living on your phone, watching the arrows, trying to make the decisions, you're not going to be living in the present moment. And so I think it's really important to balance that this is a long marathon and it's not a sprint, and you have to develop sustainable habits with everything, with food, with nutrition, with mindset, all of it.
And the worst thing you could do is get too stressed out over it and have an increase in your cortisol levels, which will raise your blood sugar. And then we also have to keep in mind that as high tech as these glucose monitors are, they're not perfect. And so, for example, both of these monitors that you mentioned, the Freestyle Libre and the Dexcom, they're measuring interstitial fluid, which is not exactly the same as the glucose levels in the bloodstream. And there's, it's close, but it's not perfect.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is being able to know your body's patterns. And first, without the technology, have a good relationship with what a higher blood sugar level feels like. So right now, when people are getting diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, you're a lot of the time getting put on a CGM right away. For me, I was diagnosed at 7. I didn't have a CGM for 15 years. I slept through the night, given my mom checked my blood sugar maybe once or twice in the middle of the night for the first few years, but there wasn't that amount of data that we have today. And it was beneficial, in my opinion, because I now can look at my number, and instead of just giving food for a low blood sugar that the CGM is saying, or giving insulin for a high that it's saying, I can say, you know what, that's actually not the case. That's not really what it is. I can test my blood sugar on a finger prick, and then I can say, see, that's the right thing. And I knew I was on the right track there.
Yeah, interesting. I just wanted to comment. One of the things that happens when you do podcasts is sometimes you have weird things happen with lights. And I remember having one interview where the person I was interviewing had the light coming in through the tiny beads, and you have shades that you use to block out the light on your window, and there's tiny holes, and the light was coming out and going across his face. And I see your right in the corner. Well, because my window, I'm backlit over here, and so you would not see me if I didn't have a ring light over here. So I know I have a ring light too, and sometimes it shines off of the frame on a picture behind me, and it's all those things you have to deal with. It's interesting. Anyway, but you brought up something that people who don't know about type 1 diabetes have no clue about, and people with type 2 diabetes generally don't have to worry about. And I think this is a good time to talk about that, is worrying about making sure that your blood sugar doesn't drop too much during the night. Normally with type 2 diabetics, all we're concerned about, or mostly what we're concerned about, is that fasting glucose in the morning. We don't usually worry about problems with their glucose during the night, even though sometimes they can have problems there too. But for type 1 diabetics, it's really crucial that their glucose in particular doesn't drop too low during the night. And do you have a strategy for trying to keep the glucose from dropping too low during the night? And this is sort of starting into our discussion of diet. I did have one discussion with another guy who was a health coach, who talked about eating some healthy fat in the evening before bed. He actually has some product with a bunch of nuts and things like that in it. What do you think about the best strategy to keep the blood glucose fairly even during sleep?
Yeah, look, I'm here to change the narrative, I think, around a lot of what we've heard that is the best for anything, right? What's the best strategy or way to eat for this or for that? And there really is no best way. And I'm not just saying that, right? Like, you can have somebody who thrives on the keto diet, somebody who thrives on high carb, low fat, who thrives on this, vegan, whatever it is. But the truth of the matter is, you have to find what works best for your pattern in terms of what's sustainable, but also for your blood sugars. There is no one size fits all. And it's actually the main issue with the healthcare system, is that they view too much all type 1s as here's what's going to work for all of you. And that's just not the case. And so you have one guy, I don't know if he was talking about type 2 or type 1 or whatever.
He was talking about type 1. Yeah.
So type 1. Okay. So you have somebody who's saying that increased fats before bedtime are going to help you sustain without having a low. I can give you 25 case examples in the next 20 minutes of people who would not benefit from that, right? Because increased fats in their diet are going to actually sustain a higher blood sugar number over bed. So it's not exactly, what is one size fits all, but hey, what happens to my blood sugars overnight? And if they're going too high or they're going too low, like, what needs to happen beforehand? So I can give you a personal example for me. If I had fats before bedtime, my blood sugars would be running high, because that fat acts like a buffer and creates a little bit of resistance to my insulin, my basal insulin that's coming overnight. So for me, it's actually more beneficial to have a carb snack if I want something for dessert, like, let's say, a bowl of berries, or an apple with like maybe just a little bit of peanut butter, something like that, because I can then give insulin for it. I know what it's going to do to my blood sugars in those 2 hours. And there's not going to be a prolonged effect on my blood sugars in that 2 to 8 hour span, which happens when you add some fats in. Now, it depends on the amount of fats, the quality of the fats, all these different factors, but all to say in the end that it's like, look at what's happening to your blood sugars overnight and understand what certain foods do to your specific blood sugars, and then make informed decisions based off of that.
Right. But I wanted to point out that whereas type 2 diabetics, until a point at which they get to having to take insulin, the big issue is their glucose being too high. And type 1 diabetics have to worry not only about it going too high, but also about it going too low. And I think the idea of using fat was to keep it from dropping during the evening.
Right. And I think that where the misconception is and really understanding is, so with type 1 diabetes, we have insulin that goes in our body 24/7 in all these different rates, right? Especially if you're on an insulin pump, you have different insulin, every 2 hours it can be for different rates. And so technically, if I didn't eat for 24 hours, my numbers based on those insulin rates should actually stay stable and should not drop. Now, if you're on shots, which might have been the case for that past episode guest that you had on, that could be possibly I can't change my insulin rates overnight time, so I have to use fats because my natural tendency is to drop. And so in his case of his bio-individual body, those fats could be helpful for him.
What percentage of type 1 diabetics are on insulin pumps?
So it really comes down to the accessibility issue that I said earlier. I would say that I would have to guess a lot of people who are on who have the option of being on pump therapy or on CGMs, they choose to do that. I think it's a larger percentage than the people who have the option based on insurance and then say, I don't want to go on, I just would rather be on shots. So I don't know the exact percentage, but I don't know if it's 50-50. I'm not really sure.
But it's based on cost and insurance coverage.
Cost, insurance coverage, and then of course, preference, right? A lot of people, there's 3 leading pump companies. 2 of them have wires. 1 of them doesn't, the Omnipod, and that's the one I'm on. And if somebody doesn't want to be on a pump and have something extra on their body, that's another reason why they might not choose it.
I see. I've really been enjoying this discussion, but I'd like to take a minute to tell you about a new product that I'm very excited about. I'd like to tell you about a new wearable called the Apollo. And this is a device that can be worn on the wrist or the ankle, and it uses vibrations to stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system. And this device has amazing benefits in terms of getting you out of that stressed out sympathetic nervous system and stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system. It has a number of different functions, especially helping you to relax, to focus, to concentrate, to get into a deeper meditative state, even to help you sleep. And there's even a mode to help you wake up. And this all occurs through the scientific use of subtle vibrations. For those of you who might be interested in getting the Apollo for yourself to help you reset your nervous system, go to apolloneuro.com and use the affiliate code Weitz10. That's my last name, WEITZ 10. And now back to the discussion. Let's talk about diet. You already set up the discussion by saying that you're here to prove that and make everybody understand that there's no one best diet for type 1 diabetics. But given that, how should we figure out what to eat if you're a type 1 diabetic? Or how should we decide what to recommend if you're coaching somebody who's a type 1 diabetic?
Yeah. So it's a great question because, right, we can't just look at it and say, oh, well, you have type 1 diabetes, just eat whatever you want and don't worry about the blood sugar strategy. Don't worry about the insulin strategy, right? There has to be some thought process to it. So kind of my rules and how I like to think about this is, first of all, what I love about coaching is my job is not to replace a dietitian, a nutritionist, a doctor, a certified diabetes educator. There is a place for all of us. And where the coach fits in is really by putting the client and the type 1 diabetic in the driver's seat and saying, you know what, I have all this information coming at me, but ultimately I have to decide kind of what works best for me. And so what you'll see a lot of is people who look outwards to follow specific diets and then they do it and it's not sustainable, right? So I think the number one rule is find something that's sustainable for you. Is it sustainable for you to never eat bread again? Probably not, right? Are you going to set yourself up for failure if you say that and then feel like, oh shoot, I can't be successful, and kind of go through that restrict binge cycle? That's not good, right? So it has to be sustainable. The second thing is obvious. It's what's good for everybody, which is lead with whole foods, right? Lead with real whole foods, less processed ingredients, less inflammatory foods. For people who have celiac, obviously less gluten. For, I think, all type 1s, there's been a lot of research on the benefits of drastically reducing dairy. And that's the case for a lot of people. What benefits people who are type 1 and not type 1? So I would say that's the second piece. And then the third piece is knowing that there's an emotional component to food, right? And that there's a pleasure element to food. And it doesn't mean we're having pizza every day, but to find a place for the foods that you love, that are part of your culture, part of your family, part of your enjoyment, and figuring out a way to have those foods and also be able to have the insulin strategies to meet it so that you don't have to compromise blood sugars.
Of course, when you say we're trying to eat foods that are going to lower inflammation, there's many, many different thoughts about that. There's a thought, and some data to show that maybe animal products and saturated fats are going to raise inflammation. There's thoughts and some data to show that lots of fruits and vegetables, anything with seeds, anything with lectins, grains, legumes, that's going to cause inflammation. Foods that you have sensitivities to are going to cause inflammation. So I'm not sure it's so easy to know what is going to reduce inflammation.
Right. I think that you're exactly right. There's definitely there's controversial opinions on what is the best diet. And you can find books written on, lectins being, terrible, and having certain fruits and vegetables that have those and being inflammatory, and exactly like what you said about opposing theories. But I think ultimately what it comes down to is, how does your body feel when you have those things? I know that when I have dairy, the next morning I wake up, my hands are literally swollen. So I know that I'm never going to fully cut out dairy, but it's not beneficial for my body. I'm puffy, I'm sluggish. I don't like the way it makes me feel. Doesn't help with my blood sugars. So that's enough data for me to make an informed decision versus having to go out and read all the research studies on if dairy is good or bad and then decide based on that. So it's really combining the inner wisdom with the outer wisdom.
So still, when you're working with, by the way, you mentioned how a health coach is different than a dietitian versus a doctor. I'm a little confused about that. What exactly is the difference between a health coach and a dietitian? Don't they both put people on recommended foods? And, I'm a little confused. What is the difference?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that the coaching industry in general, now so I'm a nationally board certified health coach, and we are the national board is under the medical board of examiners. And this is something that is new in the past few years. And even when I first became a coach and coaching people in 2015 was very what is health coaching, right? And so at the root, health coaching helps people prioritize themselves and get unstuck by helping them develop the tools and the strategies to become aware of what their blocks are, what their patterns are, so that they can move towards the vision that they have for themselves, right? And it ultimately puts them in the driver's seat and helps them tackle behavior change more than just giving them a plan to follow. Where when you see a dietitian or a nutritionist, they're going to say, okay, here's how to balance your meal at lunchtime. And here's the plan. If this is your goals, to eat exactly this, do exactly that. So we're more of the mindset, behavior change, helping you identify your patterns of what's working and what's not.
Interesting. Okay. So, let's get back to what are we going to tell this type 1 diabetic, that's coming to see you today, what they should be eating for breakfast?
Yeah, if they were to come to me and say, hey, my blood sugars are high after breakfast, what should I be eating? My role is to not tell them this is what you should be eating, because then that's saying that I know their body better than they do. So instead,
I know my body works great when I eat Frosted Flakes and I pour some extra sugar on it.
Well, then they wouldn't be right. But then they wouldn't come to me and say that there's a problem with it, And there's no reason that they're here. They're here. And while we're working with them is because they're saying, hey, this isn't working what I'm doing. I need to figure out what is. So likely the conversation goes, I'm having frosted flakes in the morning. I don't know why my blood sugars are going high after. And then I can say, all right, well, tell me a time that you did have stable blood sugars after breakfast. What did you eat that was different? Oh, you know what? I had eggs and toast. Oh, interesting. So you had carbs, but you also had some fat and protein. What does that tell you? Oh, it tells me maybe I had to have to add some fat and protein to my frosted flakes. Okay. Would you like to try that? Yes, I would. Well, let's get curious and let's see what happens after you do. Right. And that's how the conversation starts and where it goes from there.
So what would you recommend to eat for breakfast if you're a type 1 diabetic?
It's something that's pretty much, I mean, like I said, it's not.
Let's say I came to you and I said, look, I want to be perfect. I'm a type 1 diabetic. I want to live a long life. I'll eat anything. I don't care. If you tell me to eat, dried hamsters with, strawberries on it, that's what I'll eat.
It's not my role to tell them what to eat.
Okay.
And I'll stand by that. But what I will tell you is that I can give you one client that eats 70 carbs for breakfast of fruit and has perfect blood sugars after because they're on a high carb, low fat diet, of just a lot of fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. And then I can have somebody who has stable numbers after breakfast and has eggs with 2 pieces of avocado toast and has stable numbers. It's not about the food. It's about that person's body, how they metabolize it, how their insulin sensitivity levels, and way more than just what the food that they're eating is.
Now, I do think that there's a trend, especially in the functional medicine world, that diabetics, whether type 1 or type 2, should both be on a lower carb approach. But I from reading some of the blog posts on your website, I think that's something that you don't agree with.
Yeah, I think that there's people who for sure thrive on a lower carb diet, and it's definitely easier, right? When you take carbs out of the equation, it's a lot easier to not see that initial blood sugar spike. But what you see, and this isn't my opinion, this is research and science backed. When you have a higher fat diet, there is a higher A1C correlated to that and a lower percent time in range due to insulin resistance. So there's plenty of research that shows when you have a higher fat diet and you're eating carbs at the same time, you're going to have a little bit more elevated than if you're eating even kind of moderate levels of everything, right? A little bit more moderation. There's also tons of research that shows when people have a high carb diet, and I'm talking 400, 500 carbs per day, and a super low fat under 20% diet, they can have great A1Cs too. So you can find the research to support either one.
Yeah, I've talked to other coaches. I interviewed Cyrus Kambata and Robbie Barbero. Do you know them?
Yeah,
they have
I know both of
mastering
them.
diabetes, and they basically told me the same thing. I personally have not ever noticed that. Patients that I work with who have elevated hemoglobin A1C, I've never seen anybody who followed a low-fat, high-carb diet lower the hemoglobin A1C.
Yeah. And they're mastering diabetes, Cyrus and Robbie are great examples of that, where they're saying, hey, we're going to show you a different way to do it. I have ate their diet before and it's not sustainable in my opinion, but there are plenty of people who it works for them and you can't fight the results, right? Like they speak for themselves. So you can't fight the results of somebody lowering it by removing carbs. You can't fight the results of people lowering it by increasing carbs and having super, super, super low levels of fat. That to me, you're taking out oil, you're taking out a lot of those that macro that helps other things of the body, like your skin and your hair and your nails and all of that type of research, right? So there's controversy in so many different areas, but the point is that if it works for somebody, we can't knock it, right? It's a possibility.
And I guess one of the concepts is that increased levels of either fats or saturated fats, or I've even heard people claim that animal proteins decrease insulin sensitivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which of those, do you think all of those, or do you think it's just saturated fats or?
Yeah, for sure. What we can see, and we have, let's say 800 people that apply for our coaching programs per year. So we have a lot of data in terms of type 1 diabetics and food and what works and what doesn't for the majority of people. And what we can tell is the higher the dairy and the animal fats, I don't know specifically saturated
dairy and animal fats. Okay.
Dairy and animal fats, it's contributing to the higher levels of insulin resistance. Now,
and you're measuring that by hemoglobin A1C?
Yeah, by hemoglobin A1C and also time in range. Time in range, I think, is even a better indicator than A1C.
Okay, so what is time in range?
So when you wear a CGM, oftentimes the doctor will say, your time in range will set your goal between 80 and 180. So it's what percentage of the time are you staying between those numbers? And so you want that number to be higher.
Is that what the range is? 80 to 180?
Yeah, pretty much. It's you can change it.
180 sounds kind of high, huh?
For a type 1 diabetic, no, it's not, because it's very unrealistic to say that for a type 1 where your body literally doesn't produce any insulin and you're in charge of monitoring every single thing, the expectations, right, would drive people crazy if it was any lower than that.
Wow. Okay. Mm-hmm. Interesting. What about coffee for type 1 diabetics?
Oh, interesting question. So in the morning time on an empty stomach, you're going to see most likely, depending on somebody's tolerance for caffeine, how much they're drinking it, frequency, all of that, you're going to see blood sugar rise from coffee, even if there's no sugar and there's no cream, anything in it. That's something that happens to me as well. I actually have to give insulin for black coffee. Now, when you make a small shift of eating something before you have black coffee, a lot of people will see a decrease in their blood sugar response due to just that little switch.
Interesting. I wonder, what about, have you looked at people who have more of a response from coffee or less of a response? And I know there's certain genes that correlate with that. Is it more because people get a bigger response from coffee, get more of an increase in adrenaline, cortisol, and that's what spikes the sugar?
Yeah, in my opinion, what I have seen and what I'm seeing is that your cortisol levels are higher in the morning time, period, right? They taper off.
They're supposed to be, right?
Yeah, they're supposed to be, exactly. So if you're adding caffeine on top of it when you're waking up and you're already a little bit dehydrated and you're not, let's say, drinking water and you don't have any food in your system, there's just a higher blood sugar response. Sometimes I say you don't have to know the why, you just have to know the patterns. So whether that has to do with their, how frequently they're drinking it, if it's caffeinated, decaffeinated, all these different factors, if it's happening, there likely has to be insulin being given for it.
So for type 1 diabetics, are you recommending small, frequent meals? Are you recommending any periods of time where they don't eat? As you know, one of the strategies for longevity these days is intermittent fasting.
Yeah. So in our years of, working with both men and women, we've seen more men benefit from intermittent fasting than women have. And I think it has a lot to do with relationship with food, with hormones, depending on where they are in terms of what age they are. So I think it can be beneficial for certain people and depending on what their goal is.
I'd like to interrupt this fascinating discussion we're having for another few minutes to tell you about another really exciting product that has changed my life and the life of my family, especially as it pertains to getting good quality sleep. It's something called the Chili Pad, CHILIPAD. It can be found at the website chilisleep.com, which is CHILISLEEP.com. And so this product involves a water-cooled mattress pad that goes underneath your sheets and helps you maintain a constant temperature at night. If you've ever gotten woken up because the temperature has changed, typically gets warmer, this product will maintain your body at a very even temperature, and it tends to promote uninterrupted, quality, deep and REM sleep, which is super important for healing and for overall health. And if you go to chilisleep.com and you use the affiliate code Weitz20, that's my last name, Weitz 20, you'll get 20% off a chili pad. So check it out and let's get back to this discussion. What about alcohol, like a glass of wine? How does that affect diabetics?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, alcohol, let me ask you, do you think that alcohol raises or drops blood sugars over, let's say, a 6-hour period?
I've done a little research into this recently, and it's common for people to say alcohol gets converted into sugar. But the reality is alcohol gets processed by the liver, and it's a long route till it gets converted into sugar. So a number of studies show that alcohol reduces glucose response with a meal.
Yes. Exactly. I was like so curious if you knew that, or if you were familiar with that, because a lot of people think exactly like you said, that it just raises blood sugar. Now, there's certain types of alcohol, right, that if it has sugar in it and you're adding cranberry,
like a mixed drink that has added liqueur, or something like that.
Right. Exactly. Your blood sugar is going to rise from it likely. But over time, over the next couple of hours, exactly what you said is happening with the liver. You're likely to see low blood sugar. And it's why doctors are very, very careful of, telling kids before they're going to college, if they have type 1 diabetes, like if you're drinking, you have to have a plan in place for definitely eating before you're drinking, and also being mindful of your numbers overnight, because that can become a really dangerous situation. So
if the glucose drops too low while they're sleeping.
Yeah, it's a big source of type 1 deaths where.
And what do you think is the critical level that should not drop below?
So, I mean, I've seen before, no. I mean, of course, yeah, it shouldn't, technically on paper, it shouldn't drop below, let's say 75, but I've woken up in the middle of the night with numbers in my 21 years of living with diabetes. I've woken up at 35, right? So it's like, it's not that the threshold is a little bit lower than 35 before you're in kind of a danger zone, but yeah, you don't want to, the goal is to not get anywhere near there.
Okay. So let's discuss exercise for type 1 diabetics.
Okay.
So generally speaking, when I've worked with type 1 diabetics, recommended that the most important thing is to do approximately the same amount and the same intensity of exercise every day if possible.
Mm-hmm. That consistency.
Right.
Yeah, I think, type 1s thrive in routine. We thrive with consistency, with everything across the board, from workouts to sleep patterns to, nutrition. But is it realistic? Maybe not always, but as close as you can, especially I think for exercise, the more consistent you are with your exercise, the more you're going to know what your body's pattern is. But it also goes to say, if you want to do a HIIT workout on Monday and a yoga class on Tuesday and a 5K run on Wednesday, it doesn't mean it can't be done, right? It's just, you have to know what your body's patterns are for that. And you might need insulin before one of them. You may need, 30 carbs of a snack before another one, just based on the anaerobic versus aerobic, whatever type of workout you're doing, because they have different blood sugar responses.
So in general, maybe you could address that. What about the blood sugar response in the average type 1 diabetic before resistance exercise, with high intensity training, with longer distance cardiovascular training?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally speaking, exercise that's very start and stop, like if you're sprinting or if you're doing like heavy weightlifting, those are going to be things that are going to more likely increase your blood sugar than to drop it. Things like a steady state run, or let's say swimming, or playing soccer on a soccer field, or that's probably a combination of anaerobic and aerobic, but more of that where you have your heart rate at a lower period, at a lower rate, but for a longer period of time, you're going to see more of a steady drop. But it also depends on how much insulin you have on board, right? That's a key factor as well. But that's generally what you'll see for the patterns there.
And it's not unusual for, say, somebody doing an hour workout of resistance training to see their blood sugar go up immediately after the workout.
Yeah, exactly. But knowing that, right? Like, how can you get ahead of that? And I'll give you my personal experience, right? So like everybody listening, if you're type 1, like don't do this for your body because this is my specific pattern. But when I do weightlifting in the morning time, I will give myself insulin beforehand, right? Because I know that my blood sugar is going to go up. So it's normally, if I didn't do that, my blood sugar would rise. But maybe if I do that, my blood sugar is actually not going to go up because I was able to counteract it.
Right. Now, my understanding of this is another thing I read up a little bit about recently, is that's because you've used up the glucose in your muscles, and now your muscles are sucking up glucose. So the body's trying to produce some more glucose to give it to the muscles. So maybe you don't want to take insulin then and decrease that. Maybe that's just a normal response of the muscles and it'll settle down in a little bit.
Right. And for me, my main priority is not going high, right? Because I don't want to have to go high afterwards and then go into a breakfast meal where I'm already starting off high, then I'm going to go higher, right? You don't feel good. You feel more lethargic. I cannot perform in the gym as well as, if I'm high than if I'm in range. So for me, my priority is always having that lower blood sugar and keeping it stable.
And you use an insulin pump?
Yes, I use the Omnipod insulin pump to administer insulin, correct.
And does that administer the same type of insulin all day? Okay.
Yeah. And so there's this background drip that's called basal insulin. That's for 24 hours, giving me different rates of insulin based on what I set it to. So at, let's say 12 a.m., it can be giving me 0.4, where at 3 a.m., it's giving me 0.55. And then I give insulin that is also for giving corrections to correct a high blood sugar number and to also give insulin before food.
Okay. Now, there's another strategy where people will use a longer acting insulin at certain times and a shorter acting insulin at other times.
Yeah. So that's if you're on if you use shots and you're not on a pump. So you'll have your long acting, your Lantus, your Tresiba, whatever it is. And then you'll have your fast acting, let's say Humalog. And so they have different release times. And so it's for the long acting insulin, you're giving it either once in the morning or night, or you're giving it, a split dose of it. And then you're just giving the fast acting every time you eat. So it's just a different strategy of how you're administering it.
Have you found any nutritional supplements to be helpful for managing type 1 diabetics?
So I don't know if I can directly speak to direct correlations, but for me, and for everybody, right? Sleep is really, really, really important in terms of your blood sugars the next day, in terms of curbing your sugar cravings and carb cravings the next day. And sleep is a priority. So I take magnesium sometimes before bed, and that helps my sleep. So it almost that's one that I can say for myself indirectly has helped my blood sugar control.
What type of magnesium do you take and what dosage?
Oh, goodness. Now you're testing me.
No. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. It's just,
it's okay. I would say I don't, maybe you can tell me what it's, I can see the bottle. It's glycinate. Yes, I take them. That is the one that I have. And I believe it's 1,000 milligrams.
No, it's 100.
No, 100 milligrams. All right. Okay. I was one zero off.
Unless you're taking 10 of them. And any other nutritional supplements? What about berberine? What about cinnamon? What about lipoic acid? What about other nutritional supplements that are known to help with insulin sensitivity or managing glucose?
Yeah, I think that those are really popular for more of type 2, and you can see more direct correlations with that. Type 1, because of the nature, and it's just different. There's not anything that I can say that is directly correlating to lower blood sugars, or that at least I know of, or I have seen and I can speak to.
Now, what about any nutritional supplements that can decrease your risk of chronic diseases? And we know that patients with type 1 diabetes may have an increased risk of chronic diseases like heart disease.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of comorbidities that happen. And
so I'm thinking of things like fish oil, vitamin D.
And to be honest, right, like this sounds even more of your zone of genius or a dietitian, or like you can probably speak to this way better than I can. But I would say the biggest thing is understanding what your deficiencies are and advocating, because you're most likely seeing your endocrinologist and they might not be doing a full blood panel workup, things like that. And so, and it depends on what diet you have. Like I'm a pescatarian.
Your endocrinologist is not testing you for nutrient status. I can tell you that.
Exactly. So I've been a pescatarian for 11 years now. And so for me, there are certain supplements like B12 that I take that overall health, right, going to be more helpful. And yeah, I think it's individual.
Okay, that's great. I think that's a wrap for today. Thanks for sharing some useful information, helpful information for us. How can listeners, viewers find out more about your programs and get a hold of you? And I understand you have some courses both for laypersons and for practitioners. Is that right?
Yeah. So we work primarily with people that have type 1 diabetes and also families of children that have diabetes. And so we have coaching programs and courses and a ton of free resources. So you can connect with me on my Instagram, which is just my name _ in between the first and last name. So Lauren _ Bongiorno, or find Risely Health on Instagram, RISELY health.com also is the website. So we're everywhere. You can pretty much find us. But if you came from this podcast, definitely shoot me a note and I'd love to connect with you.
Oh, okay. That'd be great. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for making it all the way through this episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star ratings and review. That way more people will be able to find this Rational Wellness Podcast when they're searching for health podcasts. And I wanted to let everybody know that I do now have a few openings for new nutritional consultations for patients at my Santa Monica Weitz Sports Chiropractic and Nutrition Clinic. So if you're interested, please call my office, 310-395-3111, and sign up for one of the few remaining slots for a comprehensive nutritional consultation with Dr. Ben Weitz. Thank you, and see you next week.